Okay, this is ALHS 1113 or I'm sorry, 1011, it's another course. And this is the chapter on the urinary or excretory system. These are our learning objectives, parts of the urinary system, and so on. Okay, so we will briefly talk about the excretory system because this chapter really focuses on the urinary system. But just so that we're aware, the skin, the lungs, the kidneys, and the liver also um, excrete and expel waste products. Okay, so the excretory or urinary system removes metabolic waste. It helps with fluid and electrolyte balance, acid-base balance, and regulating blood pressure. So where do we get these wastes? Some, especially our nitrogen or nitrogenous waste, some of that has to be removed from the body. So how do we get ammonia in the body? Ammonia is produced by the breakdown of amino acids. So amino acids, remember, are the building blocks of protein. So when you break down amino acids, ammonia is produced. This is converted by the ammonia gets converted in the liver to urea, which is a less toxic waste and can be removed. Urea is the most common, and it kind of sounds like urine, most common nitrogenous waste. Uric acid is also formed by the breakdown of nucleic acids. And creatinine is formed by the breakdown of creatine phosphate. So these are all wastes that need to be removed from the body, and typically that's through urine. Okay, we have the system overview. The urinary system, like I mentioned, we are just going to very quickly talk about the excretory. Now we're going to get into the urinary. The urinary system has two kidneys. They're bean-shaped organs, very important. And if you remember, they're not contained within the peritoneum. They are retroperitoneal. They are behind the peritoneum. They are superior dorsal, so in the back, upper back, and the abdominal cavity. And then they have accessory organs. So like we mentioned, it has a retroperitoneal position. So this picture shows a transverse cut of the abdomen. And as you can see here, here's the kidney. Here's the parietal, the edge of the peritoneum. So they are located behind the peritoneum. Here's a mid-sagittal view. You have the kidneys. You have the parietal peritoneum, okay, located behind. So let's talk about the kidneys themselves. The external kidney has a fibrous layer of connective tissue. It's a harder outer layer, and it is called the renal capsule, and that protects the kidney. Okay. There's an indentation in the kidney that gives it its bean shape. So it's round and then it has that kind of indentation. That's called the renal ileum. At that renal ileum, we have vessels entering and exiting. The ileum has renal arteries that bring blood to the kidneys to be filtered, and then renal vein that take the filtered blood away from the kidney. So arteries in, veins out. Also in the ileum is a ureter, which is attached to the ileum and connects to the bladder. So the waste products, the urine, gets moved from the kidney to the bladder. So we mentioned the renal capsule, the connective tissue outer protective layer. Then with inside, that's the outer layer. Then with inside of the capsule, we have the renal cortex, the next layer, and the renal medulla, the next layer. Here's a cadaver view of what I'm talking about. You have the fibrous capsule renal capsule are surrounding the kidney. Then the next layer is the renal cortex. The in more middle layer is the renal medulla. Renal sinuses just mean opening. There's a little fat adipose tissue. The area here in the hilum, a little below the hilum, is called the renal pelvis. At the hilum, you can see renal blood vessels, arteries, and veins leaving. Within the medulla are renal pyramids and minor and major calyx, which we're going to talk about in a second. Okay, so we have the renal capsule, the outer fibrous layer, and the next layer is the renal cortex. That is the shell. It is grainy in appearance. It's a little less obvious to the naked eye, but this is an important area because it's where blood filtration happens. This area also regulates blood plasma, sodium, and potassium levels. The medulla. The medulla is where the nephrons live. And medulla meaning middle. You have these renal pyramids, as you saw in the previous slide, renal pyramids, and they're triangular shaped. They have collecting tubules for urine. These pyramids are separated by columns, and they're extensions of cortical tissue. So the nephrons are located somewhat, these renal pyramids, as you can see, are part of the cortex and medulla, but you really see them in the medulla. And the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. The nephron's where the magic happens, and we'll talk about that in a second. Then we have the renal pelvis at the hilum, okay? The renal pelvis is a big funnel. It has 2 or 3 large collecting cups, those calyxes, the major and the minor, they're cup-shaped areas at the tips of the pyramids. So where the pyramid tip, the top of the pyramids, they're calyxes, they're kind of funnel cups. And those calyxes, major or minor, pour the fluid into the renal pelvis, which is the funnel that can be led to the ureters. Okay, so the blood is filtered by millions of tiny filters in the cortex, and the filtrate goes through tubules in the medulla, and then that filtrate, that liquid, collects in the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis then empties the ureter, it empties into the ureter, where urine can be traveled to the bladder. And that's kind of the order of things. So here we have it again, the renal capsule, the renal cortex. Within the renal cortex and the renal medulla, you have renal pyramids. So see, here's the pyramid. Some of it is in the cortex. You have the calyxes that are the cups that are collecting the fluid that is going to eventually funnel down into the renal pelvis and the ureters. And blood enters and exits via renal arteries and via renal veins in the hilum, that notch of the kidney. Okay, I mentioned before that the nephron is where the magic happens. This is the functional unit of the kidney. Each kidney has millions of nephrons, and it has 2 distinct parts, a nephron. This apparatus right here is a nephron, okay? The renal corpuscle and the renal tubule. The renal corpuscle, okay? Blood is going to enter the renal corpuscle via the glomerulus. That's a fun word. And the glomerulus is a fancy word for ball of capillaries. And it's going to filter it in a cup. So the renal corpuscle receives the blood from the glomerulus, and it enters a ball of capillaries. Surrounding that glomerulus is a double-layered membrane known as the glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule. Okay? The layers of that capsule are similar to the layers of a serous membrane. As you remember, we talked about membranes a lot. So the renal corpuscle, Okay. Material from the blood is filtered here. And it gets filtered in the glomerular capsule, and that product is called glomerular filtrate. So it comes from blood to glomerular filtrate when filtration happens. If blood or protein leaks into the urine, then we know that there's a problem here at the renal corpuscle of the glomerulus. Okay. So in our renal pyramids contain the nephrons. Okay. We have arteries that enter, especially originally from the renal artery, and then vessels become smaller and smaller and smaller when the afferent arteriole then delivers the blood to the glomerulus. At the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule, filtration is happening. Then an efferent arteriole is going to remove the blood, and we'll see what happens next. Okay, so I mentioned there were two parts. The second part is the renal tubules. So the rest of the nephron is a series of tubes. We have the glomerulus, which is a ball of capillaries where the filtration happens, and then we have tubules. The first part of the tubules is called the proximal tubular, proximal tubule. Say that 3 times fast. Okay, so we have blood. The blood then becomes filtered. It becomes glomerular filtrate. We're not calling it urine yet. The glomerular filtrate travels from the glomerular capsule into the proximal convoluted tubule. That first section is the proximal tubule. The second section from the proximal tubule is the nephron loop called the loop of Henle. And there's a descending loop, obviously going down, and an ascending loop going up. So this loop, the loop of Henle, is the second section. From there, the glomerular filtrate travels into the distal tubule. Distal meaning farther away. So that's further away from the glomerulus. Okay. Then fourth, we have several collecting ducts. From the distal tubule, we have collection ducts, and those are made from cuboidal epithelium. The collecting ducts, remember we had those cup-shaped calyxes or the plural form of that. The calyces are going to collect the product, the fluid, and then drain it into the renal pelvis. So the collecting ducts lead to minor calyces, then major calyces, then the renal pelvis, then the ureters. And then the glomerular filtrate becomes what we know as urine. So I like these two graphics. One has blood, so the afferent arteriole or the renal artery here has blood with waste in it. Okay, blood that has been circulating. It enters the kidney. Okay, through capillaries, it enters the glomerulus. From the glomerulus, filtration happens, and then enters a series of tubules. And here we see the tubules. So we have the Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus. And from here, we have blood goes out the efferent, cleaned blood goes out the efferent arteriole, and the glomerular filtrate, the waste product, then goes proximal tubule, loop of Henle, ascending and descending, distal tubule to the collecting ducts, which everything pours into the calyces and ends up in the renal pelvis to go out of the body eventually via ureters. And at this point, we call it urine. Okay, this is a wonderful word. Juxtaglomerular apparatus. Okay, what is that? So it's specialized smooth muscle cells, and they are formed near the vessels, the blood vessels, the afferent and efferent arterioles that are near the glomerulus. The macula densa are tightly packed epithelial cells. So we're going to talk about what does the glomerular cells do? So, efferent arterioles, exiting arterioles, leave the glomerulus, okay? And they're going to travel through capillaries called peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta, okay? Straight collecting tubes that are part of the renal nephron, okay? The peritubular capillaries are going to wrap around collecting tubules in the nephron, allowing for movement of ions between blood and fluid. So here you have the aorta, you have the renal artery, eventually becoming an afferent arteriole here. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it's an arteriole. It enters the glomerulus, that ball of capillaries, okay? Filtration is going to happen, okay? And then right around that area, we have, we need to kind of separate what's going to become glomerular filtrate or urine, eventually urine, and we need to take the cleaned blood back out via the efferent arteriole. That happens at the peritubular capillaries. Okay, so here's another picture of it. We have afferent, comes into the glomerulus, things happen, filtration happens, reabsorption happens, blood goes via vessel afferent, and glomerular filtrate is going to leave via the proximal tubule. Very complicated looking. Here is the Bowman's capsule that contains the glomerulus, afferent arteriole, efferent meaning it's leaving. The waste products, what eventually is going to become urine, is the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, where some reabsorption and the peritubular, anything we want to keep is going to happen. And then the distal convoluted tubule, which happens to go to the main branch of collecting ducts, which dump into the calyces. Okay, here's a little video to help illustrate this.
It's a hot day, and you've just downed several glasses of water, one after the other. Behind the sudden urge that follows are two bean-shaped organs that work as fine-tuned internal sensors. They balance the amount of fluid in your body, detect waste in your blood, and know when to release the vitamins, minerals, and hormones you need to stay alive. Say hello to your kidneys. The main role of these organs is to dispose of waste products and to turn them into urine. The body's 8 liters of blood pass through the kidneys between 20 and 25 times each day, meaning that together, these organs filter about 180 liters every 24 hours. The ingredients in your blood are constantly changing as you ingest food and drink, which explains why the kidneys need to be on permanent duty. Blood enters each kidney through arteries that branch and branch until they form tiny vessels that entwine with special internal modules called nephrons. In each kidney, 1 million of these nephrons form a powerful array of filters and sensors that carefully sift through the blood. This is where we see just how refined and accurate this internal sensing system is. To filter the blood, each nephron uses 2 powerful pieces of equipment, a blob-like structure called a glomerulus, and a long stringy straw-like tubule. The glomerulus works like a sieve, allowing only certain ingredients, such as vitamins and minerals, to pass into the tubule. Then, this vessel's job is to detect whether any of those ingredients are needed in the body. If so, they're reabsorbed in amounts that the body needs so they can circulate in the blood again. But the blood doesn't only carry useful ingredients. It contains waste products too, and the nephrons have to figure out what to do with them. The tubules sense compounds the body doesn't need, like urea, left over from the breakdown of proteins, and redirects them as urine, out of the kidneys and through 2 long sewers called ureters. These tubes empty their contents into the bladder to be discharged, ridding your body of that waste once and for all.
There's water in that urine too. If the kidney detects too much of it in your blood, for instance, when you've chugged several glasses at once, it sends the extra liquid to the bladder to be removed. On the other hand, low water levels in the blood prompt the kidney to release some back into the bloodstream, meaning that less water makes it into the urine. This is why urine appears yellower when you're less hydrated. By controlling water, your kidneys stabilize the body's fluid levels. But this fine balancing act isn't the kidney's only skill. These organs have the power to activate vitamin D to secrete a hormone called renin that raises blood pressure, and another hormone called erythropoietin, which increases red blood cell production. Without the kidneys, our bodily fluids would spiral out of control. Every time we ate, our blood would receive another load of unsifted ingredients. Soon, the buildup of waste would overload our systems and we'd expire. So each kidney not only keeps things running smoothly, it also keeps us alive. Lucky, then, that we have 2 of these magical beans.
Okay. So I think that is so neat, and I hopefully that helped you put things together. Okay. So we mentioned that blood becomes what we call glomerular filtrate. And it's very, very similar. That glomerular filtrate is very similar to blood plasma. And if you remember from the blood chapter, blood plasma is essentially blood minus the four elements. Urine is pretty chemically different though. So a change has to happen. Some things like glucose, we reabsorb into the body because we need glucose. There should never be, unless you're diabetic, glucose in the urine. Okay, so we reuptake glucose. We need that. Other things like urea, that harmful nitrogenous waste from breakdown of amino acids, and creatinine, those things we can get rid of. So we concentrate that into urine. The kidney vessels. So I mentioned we have from the aorta, we have renal arteries that bring blood into the kidney at the ileum. And they become smaller and smaller and smaller until they are the afferent arterioles. And at that point, when it enters the glomerulus becomes a ball of capillaries. From the capillaries there, they exit via the efferent or exiting arteriole, also the peritubial capillaries, and some reabsorption can happen there, which will also then become venules, medium sized, to veins, and then exit out the renal vein from the kidney at the ileum. Okay, so this is kind of the blood flow. We've got extra steps in here, but I highlighted the ones that we kind of need to know. Okay, so blood flows from the glomerulus via the efferent arteriole, exiting one, into the peritubial capillaries and the vasa recta. Any reabsorption can happen here, like of glucose or secretion. Blood is going to leave the nephron via the cortical radial veins. Okay, so how does urine form? The kidney, as you know in the video and as we've been talking about, it controls fluid and electrolyte balance. It takes what we need and it gets rid of what we don't need. And so that determines urine volume, how much we make, and then the composition or concentration of it. So to form urine from blood, we have 3 processes. Glomerular filtration happening at the glomerulus at the capillary site. Then we have some tubular reabsorption. We take back what we might need. There's also some tubular secretion happening. Okay, so we've got the afferent arteriole here entering the glomerulus. Then it exits the efferent arteriole. Filtration happens in the glomerulus. Reabsorption more so in this stage at the peritubular capillaries. So that's where we decide, wait, I want this. No, I don't want this. Some secretion happens if we need to access unload some excess fluid and things like that. Hormones, and then excretion happens via urine, and exiting blood will exit, cleaned filtered blood will exit out of the renal vein. So that filtration, that all important filtration, fluid and molecules will pass from the glomerular capillaries into the glomerular capsule. And it really just depends on the size of the particles, okay? The rate of the filtration, so GFR is glomerular filtration rate, it depends on our blood pressure. How much pressure is pushing to have filtration happen? The filtrate's then going to go into the renal tubule system where chemistry is controlled. It's going to decide, what are we taking back, what are we reabsorbing, and what are we secreting? Reabsorption, so reabsorbed substances, what kind of things would we reabsorb from the glomerular filtrate? When it enters the proximal tubule and the loop of Henle and the distal tubule, from the renal tubulars, there's the peritubular capillaries surrounding that. What are the things that we take back? We take back glucose, amino acids. A lot of times we'll take that back. There should be no protein in the urine or glucose. Some mineral salts. 99% of the water in that system is also absorbed. So secretion, what's secreted wastes are going to stay in the tubule and eventually leave the body via urine. So what are secreted to become urine? The thing are the nitrogenous wastes, the urea, the uric acid, urine salts, the hydrogen ions, any excess potassium, any byproducts of drugs. Those are deemed not needed, so let's secrete them and excrete them. Okay, so again, to review this, we have the renal capsule, the cortex and the medulla, the renal pelvis here, and in the ileum. Okay, blood is going to enter the renal artery, and you can see this on the bottom, going through a series, getting smaller and smaller and smaller until we get to the afferent tubules, arteries. Then it enters the glomerulus, exits the efferent arterioles, goes to the peritubular capillaries, and then out a series of veins that get larger and larger and larger until it becomes the renal vein, and that exits the kidney. Okay, here's another, I'm a person that likes visuals, so these are, hopefully this is helpful to you. We've got renal artery, afferent, glomerulus. Blood is going to exit out the efferent, which goes to peritubular capillaries, venules, medium-sized ones, out the vein. But the waste products what happens at the nephron level is anything like excess water, nitrogen, amino acids, we're going to filter in the glomerulus. Filtration happens, okay? When we enter the tubule systems, then some reabsorption happens. So we decide, wait a minute, I want glucose back, I want amino acids back, some water back, mineral salts. And then what gets secreted as urine is the remainder of the nitrogen waste and any excess ions that we don't need. Those end up in the calyces, the collecting ducts to the calyces, which ends up in the renal pelvis, which ends up exiting the kidney via the ureters that gets stored in the bladder. So the kidneys and the lungs play an important role in preventing acidosis. We mentioned in the respiratory chapter that if we are in an acidotic state, or carbon dioxide is acid, then we blow off, we're going to hyperventilate and blow off more carbon dioxide. That would be the second bullet point here, the respiratory acidosis. So the respiratory system is going to play its role by blowing off carbon dioxide, which is an acid. Okay. Metabolic acidosis. So what if there's too much acid present in the urinary system? Then more bicarbonate ions the buffer ions need to get reabsorbed to balance out that blood pH. So the kidneys will secrete bicarbonate to kind of buffer acidotic state. The urinary system is a purification plant. It's cleansing the blood of nitrogen. We do not need nitrogen built up in our body, especially not ammonia. The liver does some purification, but the urinary system really controls electrolytes, fluid balances. It's going to filter blood, reabsorb, and secrete and produce urine. Without this system functioning, we die in a few days. Next, we mentioned the ureters. Those are the two tubes coming from each kidney that connect to a single urinary bladder. The bladder is an expandable sac that holds urine. The urethra is the tube that transports urine from the bladder to the outside of the body. Okay? So this is another example of how the respiratory system and the urinary system keeps pH in balance. So if the blood pH level rises, if it gets higher and it's alkalotic, we're going to slow down our breathing because we want to keep the acid, the CO2. Then the pH returns back to normal, homeostasis. If the pH level falls, becomes acidotic, we blow off some of that carbon dioxide, and the urinary system will maybe increase its level of secreting hydrogen, also the bicarbonate, and the pH will return to normal. Water in the body, because the human body is 55 to 60% water, we hold water in two fluid compartments: intracellular, within the cell, and extracellular, outside of the cell. 65% of water in the body is within the cell, whereas 35% is outside. And water is moving in between those compartments through osmosis all the time. So we really should take in about 2.5 liters or 2,500 mLs of water a day and put out that. We need the water. We drink water, that's some of it. We take it in through food and metabolic water. Water is also secreted output by feces. When we exhale, some water comes out, some evaporation and sweat, and then mostly urine is how we remove water. So regulating urine volume can be some hormones involved in nervous system. We have antidiuretic hormone, which holds on to urination, that prevents urination. We have aldosterone and ANH. The sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight, can decrease urine production, just like it slows down digestion. If we're in a fight or flight response, the sympathetic nervous system will shunt all the blood and activity to skeletal muscle so that we can fight or flight. Diuretics make us increase urine production. Alcohol inhibits the secretion of antidiuretic hormones. So what happens is it makes you, it acts as a diuretic. It makes you pee off too much fluid, and that's how you can get dehydrated. Caffeine increases blood flow to the kidneys, also increasing urination, increasing glomerular filtration rate, and decreasing our sodium reabsorption. And then there are diuretic drugs that may inhibit the active reabsorption of sodium, making us urinate more. The urinary bladder. So we mentioned the glomerular filtrate is going to pool in the cup-like calyxes. Then it's going to go to the renal pelvis. Once it's in the calyces, the concentration can't be changed, and it's urine now. So it goes from glomerular filtrate to urine. The urine collects in the renal pelvis, flows down the ureters into the urinary bladder where it is stored. The urinary bladder is a small hollow organ posterior to the pubic symphysis bone, and it's behind retroperitoneal, the peritoneum. It has transitional epithelial, and it's only stretchy enough to expand as the bladder fills. It also has rugae, like the stomach, to increase its stretchiness. The muscular bladder is covered by connective tissue and parietal peritoneum. So here we go. 2 kidneys, ureters, bladder here. And then we have sphincters that lead to the urethra. Men and women. Men have a longer urethra than females. We both have urethras, but a man's is longer. That's one of the reasons women are more susceptible to urinary tract infections, because their urethra is shorter. There's less distance to the bladder, which can cause an infection. The urinary reflex, similar to the defecation reflex. As urine accumulates in the bladder fills and it stretches, and stretch receptors trigger the urinary reflex and the need to void or urinate. A full bladder sends signals to the spinal cord and then to the pons in the midbrain. I'm sorry, in the brainstem. The pons then sends parasympathetic signals down the spinal cord, descending, causing the contraction of the bladder walls, and then thus the emptying of the bladder. Urination is really muscular contraction of the bladder, and it's called voiding or urination. Urine's going to leave the bladder through the urethra. There is a part of the brain that controls the urethral sphincter, internal and external. And once you have control over that, starting about age 2 or slightly later than that in maybe boys, but that becomes voluntary. So there's the pons in the brainstem. So what happens here is the urinary bladder fills with urine. Those stretch receptors send a message to the spinal cord, which goes up to the pons, which says, hey, urinary reflex. Okay, good. Then we go down the descending pathway, down the spinal cord. The parasympathetic nervous system says, relax the bladder and open the urinary sphincters. And here's a little picture of it as well. Same idea. Urine, what is urine? Urine is 95% water, 5% dissolved solids and gases. Urine pH is 6.0. And it's just affected by your diet, the amount of water you drink, drugs you take. A lot of the substances in the dissolved substances are nitrogenous waste, so your urea, your uric acid, and your creatinine, your electrolytes, and some pigments making the yellow color like urochrome. To summarize, oh, and I love this. This is such a pretty picture. To summarize the functions, the excretory system synthesizes vitamin D. It makes renin and erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is not needed for red blood cell production, and renin has to do with maintaining blood pressure and fluid balance. It eliminates wastes. Like I said, it regulates blood volume and blood pressure. It maintains acid-base balance in the body, as well as fluid and electrolyte balance in the body. And I think this animation is really neat because it shows blood entering, going through the nephrons, and then exiting, and then urine exiting the ureters. And that is the urinary excretory system.